Hello and welcome to the Daily Aus. I'm Harry.
I'm Emma.
From stacking shelves to tapping away at the till, shops in Australia are run by workers whose future pay and conditions hang in the balance. The National Workplace Tribunal is hearing a case that could see the minimum gap between shifts cut from 12 to 10 hours and scrap rest breaks for higher paid retail managers. Some of Australia's biggest companies are supporting the move, including Woolies, Coles, Kmart and MECCA. Meanwhile, ex-Lovisa staff are suing their old employer over allegations they were underpaid and were regularly and illegally deprived of rest breaks. Today, we'll take a look at some of the big legal battles set to redefine Australia's retail scene.
Harry, we're talking about some pretty big name brands, a lot of movement in the space of workers' rights and retail today. I know you and I have spoken about working in retail before and what a formative experience it can be for young Aussies, young people especially.
Let me guess, you were at a mall at one point in your life.
I actually went down the hospo route.
Okay.
But I consider myself a reformed retail girly because I worked in like a juice bar in a Westfield.
Okay.
So I was meeting people on their retail adventures, you could say.
It's just that, Emma, you could sell me anything.
Wow.
I think that you've just got the retail knack in you.
Thank you so much, Harry. If this goes belly up, I might be dropping my resume into a few shops. But in all seriousness, we are talking about some very real cases and examples of change in the industry. I want to get into this really interesting case that you came across because I know that you have been buried in the details. You are the expert now on this Fair Work one. Can you explain what's going on with this story?
So this particular story actually stretches back to February last year, although it has emerged in the headlines in more recent weeks, and I'll get to why that is. But basically, the Australian Retail Association made an application to the Fair Work Commission to make some changes to retail awards. That was a massive word salad, so I'm going to break that down a little bit. Yep, I can see it coming in there for me.
What is the Australian Retail Association, first of all?
Very good question. So the Retail Association is a professional body representing some of the big companies and retailers around the country. So it does range from some of the big businesses that we know about to smaller businesses and the bosses of those businesses that might employ just 5 or 6 people can join up to this association. But it's not an association for retail workers. Okay. I'll just sort of make that point as a point of clarity. So when I talk about retail awards, which is the next thing I mentioned in my word salad there, an award is the formal set of conditions and pay arrangements for retail staff or staff in a particular industry. So if you work in hospitality, as you did, Emma, you would be very familiar. You are covered under a certain industry award. So when I worked at Macca's back in the day as my very first job, I was covered by the fast food award. And I remember on my payslip, I would have the very specific award title and details, and I could go and check that at any time to see what I was entitled to as an employee. So basically what the Retail Association has done is they've gone to the Fair Work Commission, which the last piece of my salad is the Workplace Tribunal. So it's sort of the one-stop shop for a lot of workplace disputes around the country. But they also set the conditions of awards, so these specific industry awards. And if you want to make changes to the award, you have to go to the Fair Work Commission. And that's what the Retail Association has done, and it's put forward a number of proposals.
Okay, so the Retail Association is a group representing a bunch of companies, brands, retailers. They've gone to the Fair Work Commission. That's the employment and industrial regulator, putting forward these changes. So what is the Retail Association pushing to change?
Yeah, so there were initially 17 proposed changes that the Retail Association was calling for. They range from some very technical sort of wording in the retail award. So as it stands, you can agree to certain things with your employer in writing. Now, there are notes in the retail award that says that in writing can also mean an email or a text message.
Yep.
So what the Retail Association wants to do is just sort of scrap those notes and say that this could include digital records as well as written records. Very technical thing.
Just modernising it, making it a bit clearer.
Absolutely.
Okay.
So they seem to be a little bit less controversial. But then when we get into some of the other award changes that it's looking into, it gets a little bit more murky. So one of the changes they want to make to the award is cutting the minimum gap between shifts from 12 to 10 hours. Anyone who works in hospitality could tell you that that's the rule in restaurants, in bars around the country. For fast food, there's actually no minimum set time between your shifts either.
So when you say like a minimum gap, you mean for example, your shift finishes at 9 p.m., that there are awards to protect workers from being rostered on any earlier than 9 a.m. the next day.
That's right. And for all retail staff, if these award changes go through, that means that they could be rostered on for 7 a.m. the next day instead. The association said it would bring it in line with other industries, that it's pretty standard, this change. And it's also looking at what's called salary absorption. You can forget that word for now because that's the technical meaning, but I'll go into what that actually looks like. So this is a situation involving higher paid retail staff. So we think of like managers or supervisors of a store or a 2IC at a fashion retailer, for instance. So for these workers, they would lose their rights to overtime and penalty rates, so think like weekends or public holidays, and they wouldn't get allowances for things like their work clothes or a meal break or something like that. And they also would lose their entitlement to those short rest breaks that we come to know as like a smoke-o back in the day. So some workers might want to go out, get a drink of water or have some tea. Depends what you want to do in those little 10-minute timeframes.
So under the retail award, there are different entitlements for breaks depending on how long your shift is.
Yep.
You might have a longer lunch break, but you might also have a shorter 10 or 15 break to just go and chill out.
Yeah, if you're
scroll on your phone.
That's right. So if you're working between, say, 3 and 5 hours, you're typically entitled to about a 10-minute break. That's pretty standard. What the Retail Association wants to do for the high-level managers is sort of scrap that right, but in exchange, these workers would actually get paid more. So the increase would be at least 25% above the current national minimum standard for this level of employee. And at the moment, that's about $54,000 a year, and that would go up to $67,000 a year.
Okay. So under these proposed changes, people that work in retail management positions would forego some of those rights that you mentioned, like certain breaks, penalty rates, overtime, etc. But in exchange, they would get a 25% pay increase that could see salaries go from about $54,000 a year to, I think you mentioned, $67,000 a year.
That's right. And it wouldn't be an enforced change either. It's just important to note that there would actually have to be agreement between the employee and the employer if this was to take effect.
Okay.
So as I mentioned, it could be a written record, could be a digital record of just signing away that waiver of entitlements to extra pay.
Okay. So what strikes me about these reforms is it does feel a little bit unusual to see a conversation like this happen between like a body representing the businesses looking to change the options available to retail workers rather than a blanket rule that sort of flips their circumstances and either forces them in or out of something. So why is this happening now? Has the Retail Association said why they want to make these changes and why they've gone to Fair Work to sort of hammer that out?
Yeah, so in its very original application back in February, the Retail Association said that, as it stands, the award is really complicated, and anyone that's had a look at the document might agree with them. So they wanted to introduce some of these changes as a way of promoting a bit more flexibility, making things a little bit simpler, and they also wanted to make these changes to make it easier to clarify some work conditions between employee and employer. So that's kind of at the heart of why they are pushing for these changes. And as I mentioned, it has been dragging on for a little while now. But the reason I came across it is because recently there have been some of these really big employers in Australia who have supported this move. So when you think about retail workers, instantly you would probably think about a big business like Coles or Kmart or Barbecues Galore maybe. And these are all companies that are now backing in this move in the Fair Work Commission. They've joined the Australian Retail Association's bid to have these provisions put in place. And that's all 17 of the initial proposals put forward by the Retailers Association. So I mentioned very technical changes right through to that higher end salary earner getting more pay in exchange for changes to what they are entitled to.
Right. I'm really interested in hearing how workers are responding to this, because I guess hearing this idea of the 25% pay increase for more senior retail workers, that does sound like a significant pay increase, especially, you know, when we talk about ongoing pay negotiations across more public service work. There's been high profile conversations about that lately, and often they're arguing over 5 to 10 to 15%. So 25% sounds significant. But on the other side, when you think about penalty rates, often penalty rates can be a 25 to 50% loading depending on the circumstances. So how do workers feel about a shift in their rights? What's the response been?
I guess the argument has been framed in that way that you do sort of give up certain rights in order to get a pay increase. And yeah, I've been really interested in this question as well, because it is a really interesting sort of dilemma that you could be put into, because I'm sure everybody would agree that it sounds nice to get a pay increase, but it comes with conditions. So the unions which represent workers have come out really stridently against these proposed changes. Okay. So the peak union body, the Australian Council of Trade Unions, said that the changes would affect 1 million retail workers in varying capacities. So that's from changing the minimum gap between the shifts to the higher paid managers and supervisors. The ACTU have accused some of these big companies that have announced their support for the changes of trying to cut pay and conditions in what they say is the guise of workplace flexibility. That's in their words.
Okay, so they're suggesting that the Retail Association might be trying to look like they're creating more options and evening out the playing field for workers, but the union is arguing that that's a bit of a disguise.
This is smokescreen is what they say. That's kind of their wording. I think it's just important to note that the Retailers Association has disputed a lot of the union's claims, especially that this would lead to lower wages and poorer conditions. They point to some other industry awards that have similar arrangements in place and say that that has been broadly successful. But whenever we talk about workplace relations or workplace disputes, I feel like it gets political pretty quickly. And the unions have already linked this case to the upcoming federal election, which needs to be held by the 17th of May for anyone that needs reminding. The ACTU Assistant Secretary Joseph Mitchell said Australians deserve to know which side their politicians are on. Are they on the side of big business profiteers seeking to cut people's wages, or on the side of cost of living relief measures that have got wages moving again? That's in Joseph Mitchell's words. I've tried to get this answer for him because I was really curious what our politicians are thinking about this matter. So the Employment Minister, Murray Watt, told TDA that he does have some concerns about the case at the moment, especially if it's going to mean some changes to worker entitlements. He also said he had a question for the coalition. He pivoted to asking whether, if they won the election, would they protect big businesses cutting workers' wages during a cost of living squeeze? So I heard back from Murray Watt's counterpart, who is the Shadow Employment Minister, Michaelia Cash, who dismissed his remarks, saying that it's just a baseless scare campaign, in her words, driven by the government and the unions. Okay, so some pretty strong words from both the government and the opposition, the Doesn't
unions
take much, does it?
And the Business Association, the Retailers Association. So when are we expecting an outcome? It doesn't sound like there are many people on the same page in this debate. It is ongoing in the Fair Work Commission. Is there a resolve in sight?
Well, there will be a case hearing over 10 days starting on the 17th of March, and I'll definitely be keeping a close eye on it. But while I'm at it, I just wanted to mention there's another case that's really grabbed my attention in recent days, and that involves former staff at the jewellery company Lovisa.
As a woman of a certain age who may or may not have purchased a lot of jewellery from Lovisa after school, or may have been adorned in her Year 10 formal jewellery by Lovisa, I was very interested in this story because, you know, along with this Fair Work story, that's some pretty high profile businesses caught up in a kind of retail conversation at the moment about worker entitlements.
Yeah, absolutely. You go to many malls or shopping centres in Australia, you'll probably stumble across a Lovisa. So it's
absolutely
something that I feel like affects a lot of people in the country.
So what's happening with these former staff?
Hello, Billy here from TDA. We have just looked at our YouTube analytics and 95% of you who are watching our videos aren't subscribing. If you want to help independent media like us grow, the best way you can do that is by pressing subscribe. Thank you so much, and back to the video.
Yeah, so these Lovisa workers or former employees have taken the company to the federal court over allegations that they were underpaid and exploited. So this is a class action involving more than 300 people who had worked at Lovisa, places like Canberra and Melbourne, and these were employees who had worked there between 2018 and 2024. So the court documents spell out some of the allegations against Lovisa. So these workers are accusing the company of failing to pay them minimum wages, telling staff not to take meal or toilet breaks, and not paying overtime. There are also some really fascinating stories, which I must add are all allegations at this stage, but this involves a manager going to another store to close up because the staff that had been there at the time weren't fully trained or experienced enough to close up a store. So just knowing the end of day procedures and practices. And this worker claims that they had to go back to their original store after doing that and perform a similar task. What is being alleged is that when traveling between these stores, you're normally entitled to a travel allowance. So that's just to pay for fuel that you've used to help out the company. And this person alleges that Lovisa never paid them for traveling between the stores.
So the claim is that they were someone with enough experience to close up the shop, that understaffing issues meant that there weren't those senior people in other stores, and they've had to kind of go between different shops, allegedly, to be that senior person, but haven't been adequately compensated for their travel time.
Exactly right. And those kind of stories is what's being heard at the moment in the federal court and tested against evidence, of course. One of these other stories that really stood out to me was that as a Lovisa employee, you have to wear sometimes up to 5 pieces of jewellery. It's all part of the, merchandising and branding of the company. So what some of these workers are alleging is that there was a common plastic bag of jewellery for the staff to wear when they were working. And when they would wear some of this jewellery, it would turn their skin green. So I'm sure anyone who has had jewellery that has gotten a bit old or something can probably relate to this experience. And so what some of the staff would do was then buy their own Lovisa jewellery, and under the rules and under the conditions of working there, they were expected to be compensated for that jewellery. But they alleged that Lovisa never compensated them, never reimbursed them for the cost of the jewellery.
Interesting.
Which they, under the rules as well, also had to wear if they were going to be serving customers and helping people out around the store. They needed to be wearing this jewellery. So sort of stuck in a bind there.
I'm always really interested in how different brands kind of set the rules for things like uniform and presentation, because when we're talking about retail, particularly fashion retail, it's almost like the employees are physical, visual merchandising products themselves. You walk into a shop, you see someone wearing something that looks great, you want to know that you can get it too. So it is fascinating to learn allegedly, the claims of how the machine kind of works from the inside.
Absolutely. And I think you mentioned, the alleged word, the all-important alleged word, and it is important to note that Lovisa has acknowledged the lawsuit and said it'll defend itself against the claims. So, Emma, I'm going to be toggling between the Fair Work Commission, the Federal Court, and Federal Parliament over the next few months. So you'll know where to find me if you're looking for me.
Thank you so much, Harry. It sounds like you're going to have a great time.
Oh, I sure will. All these things that keep the country going, isn't it?
Yeah, the important stories that matter. Thank you so much for breaking that down for us, Harry. Some really big and complicated cases there, but all of, national scale and ongoing, and we will keep you updated as Harry mentioned. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode of The Daily Aus. If you learned something, feel free to share it with a friend. Don't forget to subscribe or follow wherever you listen to the podcast, or if you're watching us over on YouTube, hello. We will be back later on today with the evening headlines, but until then, have a fabulous day.